Well, hello there. It's your old familiar book reviewing friend deep in the reads, but I'm in somewhat unfamiliar environs today because I'm currently doing an artist residency in a different town. I've been given this place to stay and a studio space where I'm doing my art. But I still found time to talk about books, and March of the Mammoths is just about over. It's that time where booktubers get together and commit to reading really long books. The one that I picked was quite the doozy because I started it at the beginning of 2025. That's right, this book took me 2.5 months to get through. It's called The Making of the English Working Class by E.P. Thompson. E.P. Thompson was an English historian and activist who wrote mostly about the history of labor and radical movements in the United Kingdom. The Making of the English Working Class is by far his most famous work, and it looks at the Industrial Revolution purely through the lens of the working class and the laborers at the sort of lower rungs of society. Thompson was well known for organizing his history writing along the lines of historical materialism, which was this way of looking at history that claimed that all of historical events are shaped by class struggle between the haves and the have-nots. This Marxist style of analysis was pushed even further by Thompson with something that he called the history from below approach. This is where he would look at historical events purely through the eyes of the marginalized lower classes, the working poor, and showed how they exerted trends and forces on the direction that history took. This kind of way of looking at history was incredibly influential when this book came out in the 60s, and it unveiled a lot of things about the Industrial Revolution that were often glossed over at the time. Namely, this idea that the Industrial Revolution improved everyone's lives. It made things a lot worse for a lot of common people who were risking life and limb in these factories for the benefit and profit of the higher classes of society. I've been hearing a lot about this book for years before I got to it, so I finally got to it and I'm so glad that I did. But although this was one of the best books I've read in quite a while, it was also one of the hardest books, if not the hardest book, that I have ever read. I mean, I knew that this was not exactly going to be light reading, but this book was fairly popular when it came out, and it's still pretty well regarded even today, so I thought it would be a little bit more accessible than it was. But nope, Thompson is very clearly writing for a specialized audience that would already be very familiar with this period. I'm thinking maybe students getting a master's degree or something. Thompson references political philosophies, he mentions all these little religious groups, all without explaining anything and kind of presuming that you understand what he's talking about with minimal context. So I was so overwhelmed at the first few chapters, which were by far the hardest in the book, that I thought, I might not even be able to get anything out of this book if a bunch of it is going over my head. But fortunately, I pushed on, and the book ended up becoming a lot more comprehensible and even a lot more enjoyable after the first few chapters. It starts off simple enough with Thompson introducing all of the things that sort of set the stage for what's going to happen in this book. And then things get incredibly complicated with all of these little religious groups and him talking about how, it was all of these marginalized religious denominations in England where a lot of this radical voice came from because they already had this long history of being downtrodden and having to work together in solidarity to eke out a place for themselves in the society. Although there were definitely some interesting parts, even in the really difficult chapters at the start, for the most part I just kind of felt frustrated going through it. It really wasn't until chapter 4 or 5 where things really took off for me and I ended up actually loving what I was reading. This is where just the narrative lifts off and Thompson makes fewer and fewer obscure and unexplained references and actually starts teaching you things. So it starts off with the ruling class becoming absolutely fucking terrified to see that all of these revolutionary undercurrents that took over France and the United States were starting to infect their local population, and they were just like, ain't no way we're gonna let that shit happen here. So they start cracking down on people in these really draconian ways. They're sending mobs of loyalists to go terrorize activists by like burning their houses down and beating them to death and things like that. And then they start passing all of these draconian laws that prevent people from gathering in groups or discussing working conditions. They can't distribute certain writing. Like, if you're caught with anything by Thomas Paine, the American revolutionary, you could get into serious trouble, including like dying in a prison somewhere. And if you decided to destroy the dangerous machinery as a means of protest, the government would fucking execute you. So it's just wild seeing all of this. And in this mix, Thompson is quoting from writing from the time, including letters that peasants would send to landlords and factory owners and things like that were just so spitting furious. It was just... And they're also hilarious in a lot of ways because they're coming up with all of these witty insults and threats that are just... they just leap right off the page at you. And all of this is kind of in spite of the fact that this book is written in a very heavily academic way, but even with all of that academic language, the turbulence of the period just really comes across as you're reading. Part 2 of this book shifts away from looking at these early activists and reactionaries, and instead starts to finally talk about the workers that we're all here to read about. You see how mass industrialization forced them into desperate situations where they were pretty much, they had to organize in order to survive. But, you know, you might be expecting a book like this to focus on things like coal miners or people who worked in steel foundries. But that was apparently the later Industrial Revolution where that was the center stage. This book focuses on weavers and cotton mill employees and artisans like furniture builders and tailors, because apparently they were the prime movers of activism, and they were the ones whose lives were the most transformed by the upheavals of the Industrial Revolution. These sections of daily life were some of my favorite parts in the book. My other favorite parts were looking at the more intense forms of activism, like the Luddites, or the early union organizers, because unions were very much illegal at the time, so unions were almost like these secret societies that you had to get into, and I love the descriptions of what they were like. Every old union had its romantic legend of its early years. The midnight meeting of patriots in the corner of a field, the buried box of records, the secret oath, the terms of imprisonment. Thus, the Society of Iron Founders, formed in 1810, is supposed to have met on dark nights on the peaks, moors, and wastes of the highlands of the Midland counties. Where such nocturnal meetings took place, the whole atmosphere was one which would have encouraged revolutionary talk, even when the immediate objective was industrial. It then goes on to talk about how they would swear these blood oaths in front of these representations of death, because everyone there was very much aware that by being part of a union or trying to organize as workers, they were very much in a life or death struggle with the government, with the factory owners, with the landlords. It's surprisingly intense, and like I said, this is a very academic and dry book, but the turbulence and the suspense of what was going on at the time, you can't help but feel it as you read along in certain sections. As the book continues, you see more and more of the harrowing work and living conditions that people had to put up with, and it goes a long way into helping you understand why so many workers were willing to risk everything just to marginally increase their living conditions. One section talks about a worker's life from childhood into old age, and as you might expect, the section on childhood is the most disturbing. Kids were being separated from their parents every day to go work long hours with dangerous machines that could rip their limbs off in a second. It's really disturbing to see. And then, of course, you look at how all of these vibrant little communities with a rich heritage in a certain craft or trade get absolutely devastated by the industrial process, and suddenly they're contending with things like famine and disease where they never did before. Even things like leisure were under attack, so suddenly anything that you might like to do in your spare time was considered a vice or a taboo that just made you sinful, so the only real good thing you could do is just be pious, attend church, and be obedient to authority. The narrative culminates in 3 back-to-back attempts at open revolution, and this leads to a huge explosion in the mass media, finally discussing workers' rights and the plight of the lower classes. This is the point that Thompson considers to be the making of the English working class, the point where former peasants who had been uprooted and disoriented by an increasingly industrialized and profit-driven society looked around and recognized that they were a new class of people, a working class that could rally around each other in solidarity. Unfortunately, the scope of this book does not cover the period where this new working class started getting concessions out of the ruling class, but it still goes a long way to showing you how this working class came to be and sets the stage for the massive gains that would follow later. It also is a great introduction to a lot of really important thinkers at the time, like Thomas Paine, Mary Wollstonecraft, Friedrich Engels, and John Thelwall. My main issue with this book was just the fact that it presumes so much knowledge that it left me hanging in a lot of places. Now, to an extent, I just have to accept that this is far from being the type of narrative history that I'm used to reading, but still, there were points where it almost felt limited just because of that. For example, it talks about the Peterloo Rebellion and shows you just how important that was, and it even illustrates it on the cover here, but it glosses over it so fast, and it even says in the book, like, oh, you've heard this story a million times, so there's no need for me to go into detail here, and it just kind of very quickly skims through it, and you're like, oh my god, but like, people are killing each other in the streets, like, I want to hear about this in detail. And then there's stuff about the women, where are the women in all of this? I was aware that there were a lot of women's rights groups that were cropping up at the time, which were closely associated with labor. And while the book does touch on that stuff, I would have liked to see it a little bit more and maybe integrate it alongside what the men were going through. When you read a book like this, it's impossible not to reflect on just how hard-won all of these basic rights that we take for granted have been in history. A lot of these labor rights that took so long to win are being eroded in the developed world right now. Not only that, but the conditions described in this book have not gone away in the world. They've just been exported to the third world and impoverished nations. So, yeah, this is a really important book just to be aware of that kind of exploitation. A really well-rounded portrait of what life was like during this period for the working classes. This is not an easy book at all, but it does help to take notes and mark out important pages like I've done. I definitely see why it's considered a masterpiece. It's just that a lot of it did go over my head, so maybe I'll be able to come back to it years from now and have a little bit more grounding to really get everything I can out of it. I kind of waver on how I would rate it. I would say somewhere between 7 and 8 out of 10, so let's just say 7.5 out of 10. But yeah, have you read The Making of the English Working Class? Or have you read any books about the Industrial Revolution, or labor rights, or activism? Preferably one that's a little easier than this. I would love to hear from you. And did you read a massive book for March of the Mammoths? Let me know what you read, and let me know if it also took you 2.5 months to get through. But yeah, I have been deep in the reads. You have been hopefully not bored to death by my long-winded review of a book nobody cares about, but anyway, thank you all for watching. I don't know when I'm coming back, but I will see you next time.